Today we're going to discuss trust, reliability, and honesty, engineering code of ethics. Engineers in the fulfillment of their professional duties shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public, perform services only in areas of their competence, issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner, act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees, avoid deceptive acts, conduct themselves honorably, responsibly, ethically, and lawfully so as to enhance the honor, reputation, and usefulness of the profession. So, one of the big reasons you want to be trustworthy and honest and reliable is you want to avoid new regulations. You don't want to be that guy. A lot of times when they make new regulations, they conveniently name the regulation after the guy who made you get the rule. So you really don't want John's Law if you do something stupid and get somebody hurt. And the reason regulations get made is because, for the most part, engineers, the people that engineers work with, are irresponsible. They do something that they knew they shouldn't have done. They knew it wasn't safe. And instead of taking the proper safety precautions to avoid any danger, they just proceeded. And somebody got hurt. And now there are a bunch of laws associated with it requiring you to follow the safety procedure. When the public stops trusting us, they start doubting our abilities. They actually question whether we should be trusted. And in certain instances, that's the appropriate reaction. And if we give them enough anxiety, they're going to go out of their way to make our lives hard. And if they start fearing us, they'll start to self-protect and generate new laws. And unfortunately, the general public tends to be really bad at making laws for engineers and scientists, because the general public tends to not be engineers or scientists. So I'm going to give you a couple examples. So if you look at the ASME codes, if you were to build a pipeline, there's two major types of gases you would put in a pipeline. The first one is natural gas. The other one is propane. Now, propane tends to be more dangerous than natural gas. Propane sinks, so it will suffocate you if you are on the lowest level. Natural gas floats straight up. There is only a thin band of concentrations where natural gas will actually light. It'll either not be dense enough and not have enough natural gas to light up to begin with, or it'll be too dense and it'll suffocate itself. Propane, on the other hand, has a much wider band, much more able to react with itself. When natural gas burns, it makes a flame. It doesn't explode. Propane explodes. But when you look at the rules and regulations, it's natural gas that has the strict rules associated with it. And the reason for that is when the regulators came along and said, hey, the way you're processing natural gas, it's not very safe. We'd like you to change the way you're doing it. The engineers at first said, no, we're not gonna. It's your problem, not mine. And so the states and the federal government started making a bunch of rules and basically just kept throwing stuff at the wall until something worked. And then we had all these rules associated with natural gas that are really irritating and sometimes don't make any sense. And then they found a way to separate propane from natural gas. And at that point, the engineers said, you know what? These sets of rules actually make sense, and started following them. And so really all the rules we have for natural gas should be dumbed down to what we have for propane. But because of the way society's structured and the way people fear things, we can't do it. And it's because up front, the engineers and the people building the pipelines didn't care. And you need to get in front of these issues now. You don't want to be the reason that there are new rules. Now, once the natural gas people and everybody realized, hey, we don't really like these rules, we're better off working with the federal government making the rules, and that's when ASME formed. Now, technically what happened is the city of New York said you had to insure every pipeline, and the insurance companies would only insure pipelines that met the ASME code, and then eventually New York City said, you know what, maybe we should just require everybody built to the ASME code, and then ASME took off. And so you would imagine other industries seeing this, because ASME was actually really beneficial for everybody involved. It set a set of standards that everybody should be working to. It was flexible in the sense that if the science changed, it would change a lot faster than the government. It would change solely based off of the science, not based off of what politicians liked what construction companies. You'd imagine that the other industries would follow suit, and some did, but some industries didn't, which is why the FDA exists now. When the Food and Drug Administration came into existence, it wasn't because of some agreement between drug companies and the federal government. What happened was the drug companies and the federal government, what happened between the drug companies and the federal government was they came in and said, hey, we're having all these problems with the way you're processing drugs and selling them. Could we work something out? And the drug companies just kept saying, no, we're not going to work with you. And they kept selling snake oils and poisons. And one of the big things is when somebody's dealing with a dying relative, especially a child, they will do anything to have the feeling that they'll get to keep that person, even if they know it's not going to happen. And there are a lot of dishonest people in the world that will take advantage of needing to have that feeling, and they will sell you snake oils. And so because these snake oils salesmen, people promising a cure-all for every disease, there's still a lot of them today, but now you can get arrested for it. The FDA came into existence, and now there's a ton of laws that govern the way a pharmaceutical factory is allowed to be built, allowed to be maintained, how they're allowed to sell drugs. And there's a lot of rules that are nonsensical, and the reason that they're nonsensical is because the FDA was just throwing stuff at the wall until something worked. They didn't work with the drug companies, mostly because the drug companies didn't want to work with them. Had they gotten in front of this issue, if the drug companies worked with the federal government and said, hey, if you follow these sets of rules and you require these sets of agreements, there'd be less snake oil salesmen, there'd be less people selling poisons instead of drugs, things like that. And so that's really where you want to be. If you know something's going to be dangerous or unsafe or anything like that, you want to go out of your way to protect it and make sure it doesn't hurt anybody. And you want to work with the federal government and the state government to make it so when they make new laws governing engineers, the laws make sense. But if you don't do that, you're going to cause people to self-protect and get all these nonsensical rules. So you want to establish trust, and this is more or less the checklist of things you need to do to establish trust. You need to keep long-term relationships. There's a saying, you'd rather deal with the evil you know than a new evil, and that's what that is. You want to get to know people, and you want them to know you. And you need to be honest when you're working with them. You need to do the right thing. If they know you're an honest person, they're a lot more willing to give you breaks. And a lot of times, the truth is you need a break from time to time. And you need to give others a break from time to time. But if you don't trust somebody and they just ask for a break up front, it's a very reasonable thing to say, no, I'm not trusting you. I don't know you. So you want to maintain a good, long relationship. You need to do the right thing so that when you run into a situation where you need to go and say, hey, I need a break, they already know who you are, and they're more willing to work with you on it. You need to honor your commitments. If it's clear that if you say, hey, I need a break, but I'll do this, that, and the other thing for you in the back end, you're not really asking for a break. You're negotiating some kind of agreement, and if you've been honest, you've maintained a good relationship with this person, you're not really asking a lot. So you need to be prepped to honor all of your commitments. You need to admit when you screw up. If you're the type of person that does a lot of finger pointing, who doesn't acknowledge their own mistakes, doesn't take criticism well, things like that, people aren't going to want to work with you. And to be quite frank, it's going to look dishonest. And unfortunately, when it comes to social things like trust, Um, the appearance of dishonesty sometimes is just as bad as being dishonest in and of itself. So you need to admit to your mistakes. You need to communicate and be transparent. This means when you start a project, you do need to talk about all the things you plan on doing. If you have a plan and it's written down and email the plan to everybody, but not everybody reads it, and one of the steps seems kind of funky when you get to it, people will treat you like you hid it from them, that you were being dishonest because you weren't being transparent. You need to make sure that all of the information is communicated as much as possible, as frequently as possible. And lastly, ask for help when you need it and be helpful when others need it. This is another way of saying you need to care about others. If you do all of these things, you will be trustworthy. It'll take time, and from time to time it'll be frustrating. Honoring your commitments, admitting you're wrong are very difficult things to do. But if you do all of these things, you'll be considered trustworthy, and people will want to work with you, and they will want to promote you. Now, there are types of dishonesty. There's lying. That is intentionally conveying false information. I don't think I need to tell you to not lie. I think you already know that's wrong. And from a Kantian point of view, from a utilitarian point of view, there's a lot of reasons to not lie, so just don't do it. There's deliberate deception. This is intentionally misrepresenting data. So if you look on the slide to your right, that's intentionally misrepresenting data. I don't know what their motivation was in this slide. I think they were trying to say that Sarah Palin had 70% of the vote. I don't know. But really, she had somewhere around a third. That's not the number they wanted to report because it didn't sound as impressive. The next, and this is a subset of deliberate deception, is something I call SMEflation. This is really common, especially when you have a contractor. So the new guy does not get as paid as much as the guy who's been on the project for 5 years. And from time to time, you have to hire what's referred to as a subject matter expert, a SME. By definition, a subject matter expert has 30 years of experience with that thing. My father is a subject matter expert on torpedo mechanics, torpedo maintenance, and torpedo acoustics. One of the red flags when you're dealing with subject matter experts is when you ask them their area of expertise. When I just described my father's expertise, it was specific things about torpedoes. It wasn't just torpedoes. If a subject matter expert says he's a subject matter expert in engineering, that is far too broad for reality. The reason this happens is because you can pay, or a subject matter expert can demand 2 or 3 times the average salary, and it just pays well. So people will say, I'm a SME just for the higher pay, but in reality, they might only have 2 or 3 years more experience than the new guy. There's partial truths. This is omitting information, withholding information. Sometimes this happens by accident, and it comes across as untransparent. So you need to make sure when you don't have all of the information that you stated, that there is missing information. You actually have to say out loud, I only have a part of the view, but this is the information I have. If you try to act on partial information, and the information you don't have or you omit ends up being really important, it comes across as a lie. Whether it's a lie or not is unimportant. Perception matters. If it looks like you were lying, you were lying. If you have any form of bias or self-deception, if you watch the Therac video, what they were running into was a form of self-deception. They didn't believe that they could fail. They didn't believe that the software could cause a problem. That's self-deception. If you have any form of bias, if you have distorted reality field, or if you're working with somebody who has distorted reality field, they're biased. If they refuse to take a responsibility for their own actions, they're biased. Or they might be self-deceiving. However, all of these come across as lying. This is probably the most egregious thing you are going to do when you first get hired. You're going to either be biased or you're going to think you're perfect. Both of them are terrible things to be. The last is poor due diligence. You're probably going to do this the most. This means double checking your work or relying on the unreliable. So I had a defense contractor who liked to give skewed answers all the time. They would word things funny. And this is a case of a combination of partial truths and deliberate deceptions. I'd ask a yes or no question and I wouldn't get a yes or no answer. And I'd ask, what the WTF? What's this all about? And because I didn't trust this contractor, because they did this all the time, I would actually have to go through all of the records and double check everything. And sure enough, I would always find something. And because of this, we actually added 2 weeks to a month to every schedule that was related to this contractor because we knew that they did this stuff. And we would find this stuff immediately. But we'd have to go to the captain and the program manager down in DC and say, look, they left out all these tests saying that they didn't need to do them, but the contract says they need to do them. And when we talk to the actual subject matter experts, these tests are integral in performance testing. They can't be skipped. And they did this all the time. But we also had defense contractors that gave us all of the information, answered our yes and no's, gave us anything we asked for, and then they'd come to us and say, hey, we have a problem. We need an extra 2-3 weeks of schedule. We need an extra 6 months of schedule. We need an extra $1 million to do this test because, and then give us all the information. We were really willing to give them that $1 million because they had told us the truth and been transparent with us the entire time. And it sounds strange, but it's at the end of the day, it's actually a lot more profitable to be trusted. If you're trusted, when you go ask for $1 million because you need to do extra testing or you need extra hardware or whatever it might be, the people you're working with are a lot more willing to give it to you than if you try to pull some BS that I've listed here. Now, I had an actual instance when I was working construction with x-rays. You have to x-ray welds on compressed lines. And the reason you have to x-ray welds is when you do an x-ray, you can see where the weld wasn't done correctly. And when the weld hasn't been done correctly, when you pressure test the weld, which you also have to do, there's a high likelihood that it'll fail. And when you pressure test and there's a failure, the failure tends to be spectacular, very dangerous. And so I got to the construction site, I saw the x-ray techs, I was talking to them, what was going on, but I was new, I didn't know what was going on. At one point, the x-ray tech handed me a thumb drive and said, you need to put this on your computer and you need to send it to your boss. And I didn't fully understand, but what I found out later was there's an actual legal requirement that the engineering firm involved store this data. So that's what I did. While I was doing this, the foreman came out and said, I want you to show me all the past welds. That is to say, the welds that didn't have any issues. And so the x-ray tech went and showed him all the welds that had passed. Now, I need to point out that the welds that had passed, the welds that had failed, had all been on my thumb drive. But the foreman was being explicit. I only want to see the ones that passed. So that way when we were having a meeting later, and my boss asked, hey, foreman, have you seen any failed welds? And the foreman said, no, I haven't seen any of the welds fail. I think we should have them all approved because, they're doing so well. At which point my boss sent the x-rays of the failed welds to everybody on the phone and said, more than 10% have failed. Not only do those need to be fixed, but that's usually a red flag that all of them need to be redone. Um, this did not look good for Don. This was the point where even Don's boss called him and said, WTF, I can't trust you to do a good job at that construction site. So if you're working here at URI, if you're doing research, these are probably the 4 variants of dishonesty you might see and that you want to go out of your way to not do. First is falsifying data. So this is distorting data, misrepresenting data, omitting data if it's relevant, making up data, lying, failure to respect intellectual property of others, so sharing secrets or ignoring patents, trademarks, copyrights, things like that. So if you use SolidWorks for your research, unfortunately that is a case of disrespect. You're not allowed to use SolidWorks for the research. You're only allowed to use SolidWorks for the teaching. Then there's plagiarism, claiming work that isn't yours, lying about who owns that work, inappropriate attribution of authorship, adding a name. So you write something and then you add somebody else's name to the report. All right, so why be trustworthy? Well, there's a utilitarian reason for it. Your lies make us all look bad. Being trustworthy tends to make people more willing to share information. From deontology or Kantianism, you don't want people lying to you. Being lied to is a form of dehumanization, and it prevents you from having your own autonomy to a certain extent. Now, I want you to think for a moment. Do you have a family member that can't keep secrets and always ends up being, and so therefore always ends up being the last person to be told something? In my family, this person's my mother. Nobody tells her anything unless they want everybody to know it. So there's an excess and deficiency of trustworthiness that you kind of need to do a tap dance with. So you need to tell the truth when it's needed, but you're allowed to omit information when it's not, and that tends to do with secrets. If you share information that's supposed to be kept secret, or you share information to hurt, you're being voracious. And that's also considered untrustworthy. You can't trust that person to keep secrets for you. And then the other end is just lying. So I want you to think, if you were working on something proprietary, but you knew your spouse would tell everyone, can you see yourself not talking to them about your work? If you are that person who shares everything, you need to understand, you make the person you're dealing with feel isolated. I once told my wife that the base was requiring everybody to work from home, and the base told us not to share why. And they weren't really telling us why. Also, they told us not to tell anybody that we weren't allowed to go onto the base that day. So I was like, all right. So I told my wife, hey, something's going on in the base. I have to take that day off because I'm not allowed to go on it. But I need you to not tell anybody. The first thing my wife did was tell my in-laws that I was taking the day off. And I had to explain to her, anybody included her mom and dad. And ever since then, I wasn't really able to share with her what I was doing at work because I knew there was a high chance she would tell them. You need to understand how isolating it is for somebody to be in the situation where they can't tell their spouse or friends what they're doing because their friends repeat it. So you need to be trustworthy. You need to be an ear that's willing to listen and not share unless it needs to be shared. All right, so these are common phrases I would strongly recommend learning and using at work. So the first one comes from Siddhartha: put no faith in words, subject everything to the closest scrutiny. Um, healthy distrust makes a good base for cooperation. Test men and verify that it has been done. Trust but verify. Talk is cheap. The last three, so where's the due diligence? I would use that regularly at work. I strongly recommend you putting those into your vernacular now. If you're clearly the guy who double checks everything, actually does their due diligence, what's going to happen is the higher ups are going to give you more work because they know you're going to check. And the people like your suppliers and contractors are going to stop giving you bullshit because they know you're going to check. And you're going to be kind of a cleaning, filtering agent for your boss. You want to be that so that way you get promoted. And it's common for contractors, coworkers, suppliers, whatever, to lie, tell the truth, tell partial truths, not do their own due diligence when they're supposed to. Whenever someone gives you new information, whenever someone gives me new information, I ask them to show me. And when they ask why I care, I always say I need to do the due diligence. Being the person that always checks puts you into a position where people above you trust you and give you higher value work. So we're going to talk about contracting, consulting, and experts in engineering. The reason this is an appropriate spot to put it is one of the biggest things you're going to deal with at work is this hairy eyeball towards consultants and contractors and experts, because it's really easy to pretend you're an expert and not be an expert. A lot of contractors charge an arm and a leg to do next to nothing, and their specialty isn't doing something special, it's doing as little as possible for as much as possible. And so a lot of what you have to do as an engineer isn't so much engineering as it is policing these guys. So contracting and consulting are kind of an integral part of engineering. Typically, consultants and contractors have very specialized knowledge that is difficult to get. Consultants tend to be much older, near retirement age. Their primary focus is on meeting the specific needs and requirements of their clients. They aim to deliver solutions that align with the client's objective and budget. Big companies like contractors and consultants because they come in, get a job done, and leave. And it's not a recurring cost. So in a sense, people prefer this over having a regular employee because there's less of a sense of an urgency from a regular employee than from a contractor or consultant. Consultants and contractors tend to be compensated with a fee, so they get paid once at the end of the project. They have more freedom to get projects done. Just generally speaking, they just have a lot more freedom. So there's a lot more flexibility. So getting higher pay, getting more freedom, that's obviously a place people want to live, right? And so they'll lie about it. Now, it used to be illegal for engineers to advertise their work. And then in 1976, that was no longer the case. In advertising, consultant engineers are allowed to say what they can do and what they have done, but they can't say what they will do because they don't know what that is yet. And so you'll see when people are marketing engineering firms, they're really wordy about what they do. They'll say things like, we have done this, we have done that. They won't say, we're going to do this. Only after have you signed them onto a contract will they tell you what they're going to do. Because at that point, they're no longer advertising. They're working out logistics with you. However, with advertising, there comes lies, half-truths, exaggerations, and misleading information. So marketing is really important to engineering. You need to get it done. The organization I have posted here is actually the same organization. I went to a big naval conference, and to get any of your work presented at the conference, you had to submit it 6 to 9 months ahead of time. And when it comes to things being reviewed and secret in the Navy, once something gets approved, that's it. You don't get to change it. You don't get to reword anything. You don't get to reformat. You don't get to change your pictures. So all of the presentations had Martin Defense Group on it in big letters. However, between them submitting the paperwork and the presentations and the event, they had changed their name to PACMAR. And the reason they had changed their name to PACMAR was this Martin guy, the person that had them change their name, or the company was named after, had embezzled a ton of money from the government. And so they wanted to distance themselves from Martin as much as they could. And so they changed it to PACMAR. Now I forget what PACMAR actually stands for, but there's still a lot of projects in the Navy that still have Martin Defense Group written all over them. Because once a project's done, they don't change that stuff. They leave it as is. And so I'll never, like, whenever I think of PACMAR, so I work with PACMAR from time to time here at URI. And they're very nice people. I like working with them. But I can't not think about this. I can't do it. Because the amount of money this guy stole and the way he did it was just impeccable. These are all business development things that you need to do as an engineer. I would strongly recommend now learning to network. If you haven't already, joining professional associations and going to conferences. I would definitely, if you have the opportunity, take a class in contracting, learning how to read and write proposals. What happens with engineers a lot is you get what's called a request for proposal, where a company who's ready to pay will say, I need this job done, and then a bunch of engineering companies will come in and say, well, this if we were to do that task, it would cost us this much. URI has a special process for it. I'm not super familiar with it. I'm familiar with the Navy's process for it. Yeah. All right, so subject matter experts. Very skeptical of these guys. So you might become a subject matter expert someday, and I hope you do. But like I said, it really takes 30 years to become an expert. If somebody comes to you and says that they're a subject matter expert, give them a lot of scrutiny. Ask them a lot of questions. It's common for subject matter experts to go to court. Now, they're not getting sued in these situations. What's happening is you have a set of lawyers and a judge and maybe a jury, and the engineer is the one who actually knows everything about the product. And so, to give you an example, my father-in-law is a subject matter expert on hernia meshes. He knows everything about hernia meshes made by Becton Dickinson because he worked for them for 30 years. And from time to time, they'll get sued, and they'll call him and say, hey, can you come to this case because we have, you're getting subpoenaed and all that jazz. And this represents somewhere between 20 and 30 of all federal cases where an engineer has to go, or a scientist of some kind has to go in front of a judge and explain to the judge the science behind the product. And it tends to be associated with accidents, malfunctions, product defects, or misuse. All right, now there's challenges with this. Sometimes a lawyer will hire somebody as a hired gun. Basically, they're being hired to say specific things that's favorable to them. This is unethical. Uh, you want to be objective in these cases. You only want to state facts. If a lawyer says, "What do you think?" You don't tell them your thoughts and feelings. You tell them the objective information you have in front of you. And so you want to be impartial. The advocacy part of law really needs to be left to the lawyers and not the engineers. All right. The expectation on subject matter experts is they only take cases when a thorough investigation can be done. If somebody is trying to rush you, there's usually something nefarious going on. And part of the reason people like to rush experts is to cause them to make mistakes. So if you're clearly being rushed, push back. Say, no, I'm taking my time. Only take cases if you know you'll have a clean conscience when done. If you feel like you're lying or omitting information, you shouldn't be taking the case. Prepare the lawyer as much as feasibly possible to speak for you. They need to be objective, and they need to be unbiased in their demeanor. Look, this is what the lawyer is being paid for. Make them do it. They need to stay calm, only answer questions when asked, and be open to new information. Now, need to be clear, I am very skeptical of experts, but you need to validate them when you're dealing with them. And this applies to contractors and consultants as well. So the first is check their background. What certificates do they have? What work experience? What training? Where have they worked? Why don't they work there anymore? Um, things like that. Review their previous work. Have they done this exact thing before? Have they done something similar? How did it work out? Ask difficult questions. A true expert will be able to provide comprehensive and insightful answers. And honestly, they'll want to talk to you. If you're interrogating them and they're a genuine expert, they probably are sitting on an enormous amount of information. They probably like their job and will be willing to talk to you about whatever question you have for them. Look for consistency. A genuine SME should demonstrate a long-term commitment to their field and continued growth in knowledge and skill. These are some red flags when you're dealing with experts. If they keep telling you how important they are, they're probably not important. If they keep saying, I'm a doctor, or I'm the lead engineer, or I'm the project manager, or any of that crap, they keep having to say it. They're insecure. And it's probably because they don't know what they're doing. If they keep going back to, hey, I worked for this really big company. I used to work for GE. I used to work for Procter & Gamble. I used to work for whoever. Why don't they work there anymore? It's not super important that you work there. What's important is you don't. Why don't you work there anymore? Did they let you go because you're incompetent? That's a very common reason to be let go. Is that why you're here now? The reason they're doing this, again, is because they're insecure. They don't know what they're doing. There was probably somebody at that company that did the thing you need him to do, and now he has to figure it out himself. There's some inconsistency in their story. People who are lying tend to exaggerate, especially on their expertise, and they don't keep their story straight. You got to remember, when somebody's lying, they don't tell you what happened. They tell you what they said the last time, and it's never the same. I have seen stuff, terrible things, and people ask me about them. I always describe it the same because it lives in my brain. I know what I saw. But when you lie, You're manifesting something, you're making something new, and so it tends to grow every time you tell it. If they get super defensive, when you ask them or say things like, I don't know, I'm sorry, they get defensive when you ask them questions. Look, the answer, I don't know, let me check, is a reasonable answer. But somebody who is lying about their expertise tends to refuse to say this. If they're unwilling to learn. Real experts know they don't know everything, and they're not uncomfortable not knowing everything. And so when something new comes along, they usually are curious about it. However, if they appear to be shutting down when new information is presented to them, probably not an expert. Now, the reason I'm telling this story is I was on $1 billion contract once, and a rounding error of less than 1% would account for hundreds of thousands of dollars. You know, a rounding error of 1% would be $1 million, right? So we had this expert with us, and I remember looking at him and having the thought, this man is only a little bit older than me. The way he talks, the way he behaves, I'm pretty sure he's not a real adult yet. My father was a subject matter expert on the thing that we were supposed to be meeting about. And I saw a lot of my dad's peers there. And his go-to person, the person he would tell me to go talk to when he was too busy, was there. His name was Bill. And the meeting was going, and I can't tell you what the specifics of the questions were, but Bill started asking this. Well, actually, I can. So there's this expert, there's Bill, and then there's the captain. The captain had a PhD in mechanical engineering. He had 30 years of experience with torpedoes, and not just like torpedo design, maintenance, but also use. And then Bill had all of the same expertise my dad had. And at one point, the captain said very clearly, when we say models, we mean tangible objects, something I can pick up, I can play with. We put a lot of money and value in models. We trust models more than simulations. If it is done in a computer, if it is just physics and math, we don't trust it as much as a model, and we're going to call it a simulation. And so this expert promised Bill and the captain that their current design for this new weapon was going to give them a 10% improvement in performance. And I need to be clear, when you're already working with cutting-edge technology, you spend $1 billion on maybe 5% improvement in performance, not 10. When you get 10% improvement in performance, you ask, how'd you get that? What modifications did you make? And said expert says, no modifications, that's what our model is doing. And so they asked him directly, is this a tangible object that we can pick up, or is this a computer simulation? Is this living in a computer? And the expert said, no, this is a model. And he, instead of saying 10% more, he actually said the number, at which point the captain and Bill looked at each other and then said to him, we've never gotten it to do that. And we've launched this thing in water. What's going on? And they started doing the 5 whys because they knew something was wrong. And this is a grandiose claim I need to be clear on. And so the expert got really defensive and ended up talking down to the captain, basically calling him an idiot and saying, I'm a PhD, I'm an expert in the field. And keep in mind, this captain had a PhD in mechanical engineering. He had the right experience to be here. At which point the entire room, well, really the captain got PO'd at this point because you don't talk to a captain that way, and said, you're going to take us to this model right now so we can see it. And sure enough, it was a computer model. So by our definition, it was a simulation. Further, a lot of the assumptions were just wrong. And they were able to identify what the assumptions were because Bill had had enough experience where he had had this conversation before, and he knew what the common mistakes were when you were building a computer model for a torpedo. And he pointed them out, and sure enough, he was right. This expert was asking for millions and millions of dollars to do something, to test something that we already knew the answer to. And had we not done the validation of whether he was an expert or not, he probably would have gotten it. So we're going to do a case study. If you were watching this from home, when we get to the questions, I want written answers. But the background here is you work for a biotech company that manufactures the only reliable hernia mesh. This mesh is the only way to repair hernias for patients 65 and older. Hernias can drastically reduce the quality of life, especially if you're over 65. The case Wyeth versus Levine has caused thousands of new lawsuits. Specifically, a drug label can specifically say, do not inject, will cause gangrene, and be liable if the patient gets gangrene. That literally happened. In New Hampshire, a drug label said, don't inject, will cause gangrene, and the doctor did that, and the woman lost her arm. There's specifics to that case that I can talk about after class, but because of this, we have a new problem. So if you were to take the mesh out of its packaging, this is what it would look like. The interior says, do not sew. The orange section, the middle section says, only sew, do not cut. The red section says, do not sew. So you are allowed to cut the red section to fit just right, but outside of that, you're not really allowed to do too much. And you're supposed to sew into this orange section because it's the only section strong enough to keep the mesh together. Now, this is pretty explicit, just looking at it, right? Now, in addition to that, the hospital must ensure that the doctors know how to perform the hernia surgery before the mesh can be sold to the hospital. So that is to say, the hospital either has to train the doctor or send the doctor to be trained to use this mesh. The doctor must complete annual trainings showing that they know how to install this mesh. The hospital and doctor must request permission to use this mesh before surgery. So that is to say, the hospital doesn't get to keep these on the shelves. The hospital will contact the manufacturer a few weeks before saying, hey, we plan on doing the surgery. Can you ship us this mesh? All right, so every year there's somewhere between a few hundred and a few thousand nuisance lawsuits associated with this mesh. Each lawsuit is seeking millions of dollars in damages. You have to show up to court. Even if it's a nonsense lawsuit, you have to show up, or you have to pay whatever they're asking for. The company has won or settled all cases. Sometimes it's cheaper to settle. Legal expenses has made the product not profitable. The company plans to discontinue the product. What you're seeing on the right is what the mesh looks like during most of these lawsuits when they get removed from the patient. So that blue section has some metal in it that disintegrates naturally over time, doesn't really cause a problem to the patient, but when you cut it, the metal will cut into the abdomen, causing an infection, which will get the patient sick. And so that's why there's explicit do not cut here. So I want you to define the viable options for the company. Pause the video, write me an email, and tell me what you think the viable options are. So right now, the company can either discontinue the product, but the issue with that is if they did it, they would disable, deprive of freedom, deprive of pleasure all of the patients who need it. The company can increase the cost of the product so much that fewer people can be helped, make it profitable. Again, this causes a handful of people to not receive the mesh. They get disabled, deprived of freedom, deprived of pleasure. The company doesn't change anything. This causes the employees to find new jobs. The company goes under. For everybody who works at the company, they get disabled, they lose some freedom of pleasure, they lose freedom of, they lose freedom and pleasure. So if you're watching this from home, pause it, tell me who the principal stakeholders are, who's the moral audience, who cares and why. All right, assuming you've finished pausing it and writing, what I have so far is the company, the patient, the lawyers involved, maybe the hospital. All right, identify the competing concerns. The company wants to make money by selling the mesh. Patients want their hernia to go away. Doctors want to make money performing the surgeries. Lawyers want to make money by having lawsuits. All right, chemical leak. You begin your professional journey as a data analyst at a long-standing chemical company. The company has recently adopted new software that necessitates the archiving of historical data. You take on a task of entering data, some of which dates back to the 1930s. You utilize AI-assisted analysis. The software flags an inconsistency. Either the historical records are incomplete, or there's a significant loss of 10,000 gallons of a toxic chemical in the 50s, likely due to a faulty valve at your current facility. As you continue to input older records, you notice that the same section of pipe where the chemical loss was detected was replaced a few months later. This suggests that the pipe may have indeed been leaking. Faced with this ethical dilemma, you consult your immediate supervisor, who is equally uncertain about the next steps. They acknowledge that the leak predates any relevant regulations and that, based on the chemical properties, it would have likely sunk below the local aquifer by now. Furthermore, they note that there have been reports or no reports from the surrounding community which would have been expected if the chemical had been improperly disposed of. Adding to the complexity of the situation is the fact that the new software has a feature that allows for sudden and secret automated audits by regulatory agencies. If such an audit were to occur and identify this potential clerical error, or worse, evidence of a spill, the information would immediately be reported to the public, potentially causing a scandal that could harm the company's reputation and erode public trust. All right. I want you to brainstorm what to do here. What can you do internally in the company? What can you do externally in the company? And how do you think people will react either way, both inside and outside of the company?